All of the images that I'm going to be using tonight are from the Nobile and Dodal Fornia Bonifacio Bembo tarot packs. And the Nobile and the Dodal images are the copyright of the Flanoy estate. And the Fornia comes out of Fornia in Spain. The Bembo images belong to Lo Scarabeo. And with the writing of my book, I've had permission for the use of these images from all of those people, which has been very generous of them. And so I'm kind of thinking, I did have a Dodal in there, but I took it out at one stage, so there may not be any Dodal there. But you can see the year variations in these from 1450 through to 1650 in the Fornia 1983. Most of the images that I'll be using tonight are Fornia. And simply because they're sort of a modern interpretation, they're bright, they're colourful, the images are a fairly honest reflection of what's there. And so we will be exploring all of most of the stuff that we're doing tonight. We're going to be exploring through the Fornia. And here we have the Fornia Major or Marseille Tarot, the Major Arcana. So all I primarily focus on is the Major Arcana, and you'll see why. It's not that I don't acknowledge the Minor Arcana and its role, but it's not a key part of what I'm doing and what I'm focusing on. So, but as you can see, hopefully you're familiar with the Fornia ones, because, as I said, they came out in the 1980s and they're just a little bit more colourful. I basically break the 22 cards of the Major Arcana into 4 areas. The first is the Fool, who represents every man, every woman on their journey. Then I combine cards 1 through 10 as the next element, and this will become evident a little bit later on as to why I include all of those cards sort of within one component. Then cards 11 through 20, I do the same. They're sort of packaged into one component, which, for those of you familiar with the cards, leaves us with card number 21, which is the World card. And so this becomes the basis of how I approach my relationship with these cards. Just a little bit of background in terms of how I got into all of this. I was studying attitudinal healing, if any of you are familiar with that, which is a sort of a very pragmatic way of approaching A Course in Miracles, with a guy by the name of Dr. Jerry Jampolsky in Tiburon in California back in the 80s. And then I was also studying with a lady by the name of Susan Trout in Washington, DC. And Susan Trout had a very strong Jungian approach to her work, and I was learning about symbolism. As a result, we were doing dream analysis and active dreaming analysis and all sorts of things to do with symbolism. And I came across a book by Sally Nichol called Jungian Tarot, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. And Sally Nichol explored the whole idea of the relationship, or the potential relationship, based on some of Jung's teaching, between the Major Arcana and Christianity. And that really sparked more than an interest. The best way I can describe it, what it sparked was a memory, or what I would say a knowing, that I already had, that defied my upbringing. Not wanting to sort of shock anyone too much, but I was raised a Mormon and left the Mormon church in my 30s. And needless to say, cards were deemed to be evil, and you had nothing to do with it. And so for me to have this experience of relating to the cards in this way was really quite obscure. The impact of reading Sally's work and this sense of ownership around the knowledge of this became so significant for me that I actually felt compelled to write. In other words, as I read her works, I knew that I had some understanding that sort of defied what I would call logical rationale. And I ended up making the decision to go and live in Italy while I wrote the book. And so I spent what was originally deemed to be 6 months, ended up being just short of 12 months living in Italy while I researched and wrote about my experience of understanding as it related to these cards. Now, two other things happened that were quite significant. One was when I got off at Ciampino Airport and walked down the stairs of the plane to go into the airport from the plane. I had tears as I had this experience of feeling like I had come home, and which is kind of ironic because I have no Italian blood in me that I know of, and we've sort of done our DNA tests and what have you, and I'd never been to Italy before that I was aware of, and the experience for me was very profound. Within the first 2 weeks that I was there, based on the advice or the encouragement of people who we were renting the apartment from, who lived in Brisbane, by the way, I went to Monte Cassino, which wasn't far. It was only about 70 kilometres from where I was living. And Monte Cassino is quite a famous abbey. It came to fame during World War II predominantly, but it's famous for a whole lot of other reasons. But I went to go and listen to Gregorian chanting. And for any of you who are familiar, that's living 5th century history, basically, when you listen to Gregorian chanting. And to be in this beautiful abbey listening to monks singing was just such a privilege. Prior to the church service starting and waiting for things to settle, I was seated waiting, and next thing I had this voice. Now, I don't have a lot of voices. I've had one or two at a time, but not a lot. And I had this voice say to me, "Welcome back. You've come back to finish something you've started previously, and now it's time to finish it." And so literally, I felt like after having had that experience that I understood what was going on. The added segue to that was that when I was deciding to go and I knew I wanted to write, I decided not to take any books with me as reference books. I purely went with the intention to write. And literally what would happen was I'd wake at 4 o'clock in the morning, I'd go and sit at my desk and I would just start writing. And it was like I was writing stuff that I've known for a long time. So that's a bit of background. Now, you will either believe that or you won't, but I'm just giving you my experience of what went on in terms of how this turned up. And hopefully, and I'm pretty confident in saying you won't have seen this unless you've read my work or seen my work before, because I don't believe anybody else has sort of come up with this understanding in the way that I have. The World card, which once, if anybody's had the opportunity to spend any time in Italy, the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel are common symbols at most cathedrals or abbeys all throughout Italy, and you'll see them in many occasions around a mandorla, which is that almond-shaped wreath that I call the sacred yoni, by the way. But you'll actually see those figures quite commonly throughout Italy around Catholic churches everywhere, as a matter of fact. I want to share with you what I think is the most important symbol in the tarot. That brown markings behind the dancer in the cards, as far as I'm concerned, is the most important symbol in the Marseille Tarot. And I'm going to call it infinite consciousness, or another name is eternal knowing. Now, you can call it God, you can call it whatever you want, but they're the words that I choose to use for whatever it is that exists behind the dancer within that sacred yoni, within that wreath, that mandorla, and there's, if you look behind the dancer, there's nothing there. There's just color. There's no symbols. There's nothing else. Just this figure, or just this color. And what happens, and what this mandorla is all about, is the way in which infinite consciousness embraces infinite possibilities. And so this image that we have here right now is infinite consciousness looking through the mandorla to the back of the dancer and back into what's on the other side. And I thought, what an interesting perspective to be able to incorporate the notion that something exists on the other side of that mandorla, and what I'm going to suggest to you is that through that mandorla, and we're going to give it a name shortly, there's the opportunity for infinite consciousness to explore infinite possibility. And that everything, and that in fact, this portal is a prism. And the prism takes pure light, white light, and through the prism, as you can see, creates the rainbow. And the rainbow of 7 colors represents the chakras as 7 dimensions of infinite possibility. What else do we find on the other side of the card? We see a bull, a lion, an eagle, and an angel. And so they represent physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And so all of a sudden, what we end up with is the 7 chakras being expressed through 4 dimensions of experience, which the physical relates to the material, the mental, obviously the mind, the emotional to feelings, and the spiritual to desires. I use the word spiritual in the context, if you think of team spirit, it's what it's the motivation for what we do and how we engage life. And so the element of spiritual is reflected as what we desire, what we motivate, or what motivates us. Okay. So we turn that around, and now we're back on the other side, looking back into behind where the dancer is. And so let's now explore how this works and what this looks like. So the mandorla, I have moved so that it's side on, and we're now looking through the mandorla from the side by virtue of those few colors that are there. And on the right of it, we can see the color that exists at the back of that figure. And on the left-hand side, we see the dancer who's in front of that as we're looking at the card. So it's like we've turned the card side on. I hope everyone can get that perspective. And I'm calling this the I am portal. So in other words, the mandorla is the portal of I am. And what is I am? Well, infinite consciousness is knowing. And when it passes through the portal, it takes on a name, which is I am. It has no other anything that follows after that. That's just its name. And if any of you are familiar with the Old Testament scripture, I am that I am, is the point at which those of us on our spiritual journey get to the point of realization that we as the I am are connected with that I am, the original I am, the knowing. and it's the point of non-duality. But the I am portal is where knowing takes on a label. Otherwise, it doesn't have a label because it is nothing other than knowing. It's a verb, not a noun. Okay, and then what we have are infinite possibilities. And so we see the experiences of thinking, feeling, sensing, and desiring now manifesting. So when you multiply the 7 chakras with those 4 different elements, we end up with 28. Add into it. Now, the dancer has 2 interesting symbols in her hand. She has a small bottle, and she has a wand or a staff, which are once again symbols of, to some extent, they're symbols of the masculine and the feminine in terms of what they represent, certainly from my perspective. So when we take the 28 possibilities of the 7 chakras multiplied by thinking, feeling, sensing, and desiring, and then we add in left and right brain in terms of how they function as it relates, we then end up with, does anyone know, we end up with 56 possibilities, which may have some significant relationship to the Minor Arcana, just as a matter of observation. Prior to card games, what were very popular were dice games. Cards replaced dice in Europe, in Western Europe. And interestingly enough, there are 56 combinations with 3 dice and 21 combinations with 2 dice in terms of sequence of numbers. So we begin to see that there's a theme that exists. I don't have a rationale necessarily for what that means, other than the fact that I've observed the fact that there are these similarities that exist, and that what ended up happening was that cards ended up replacing dice. Now, dice weren't severely condemned, by the church, but when cards came in, they were. And part of the reason being is that a lot of priests and monks there used to be a dice game where the numbers or the sequence of the dice related to spiritual, either to scriptures or spiritual principles. And so the monks and the priests would basically use the dice to give people some spiritual advice, interestingly enough, and that was deemed to be okay. When cards came along, it wasn't so acceptable, which is interesting. So here we have this possibility that these cards have something to do with infinite consciousness and its way of experiencing infinite possibilities. And so what I'm going to take you through is a rationale for what the cards actually mean from this perspective in terms of what this has to offer. So where to now? So we've got this card. Now, if we follow where the dancer's looking and we follow where the bull's looking, it's nearly like we're being given a hint as to where the sequence of the cards go. And of course, I'm going to suggest to you that card number 1, which is called the Magician, ends up in this position here. Now, what this is alluding to is that he's taking a position that represents a quarter of what's represented in this card. So the Magician's an interesting character by virtue of the fact that he's got an unusual shaped hat. There's lots of people sort of talk about different things, and I'll talk about the different tools that he's got, but let's have a look at the hat. I was very blessed while I lived in Italy to go and see the Il Palio in Siena, the horse race. And they have, there's contradas, which is sort of like communities that lived within Siena that each have a different focus. They have their own sort of medieval logos, but they have a procession. And I think that I don't know, there could be 12 or 14 contradas. I don't remember off the top of my head, but only 10 of them race each time in the Il Palio, and they mix them around. And the 10 teams or groups that are represented, they have a procession, and it's a medieval procession. And here we have a page riding a horse with a hat that's nearly exactly the same as the magician. As you can imagine, I was very excited to think this wasn't something that was in somebody's sort of mind in terms of what a hat looked like from medieval period. Here we actually see this image of this hat being worn by this character on the horse, and it's very real in terms of part of the pageantry in Siena, as it represents what was happening historically during that time. What's interesting is that card number 11 has a similar shaped hat. And so I began to play with the idea, was this a coincidence? Or was there some relevance? Now, this meant a lot to me, more so than what probably other people would have focused on, because when I was doing my work with Susan Trout and doing symbolism, a big part of my work was doing mandalas and drawing mandalas. And because, for whatever reason, the tarot captured my whole concept, I started doing mandalas using the tarot, the Major Arcana of the tarot, inspired by Sally Nichols' work. And and so I would draw these mandalas. But what they were inspired by was a dream that I had with a snake. And the Oribus, if any of you are familiar, is the snake chasing its own tail. And I had this dream where, in this dream, I was chasing a snake, and it was a giant snake. It was like one of those snakes out of the anaconda, just huge pythons. I cornered this snake, and no matter what I did to try and kill it or capture it, I couldn't. And then later on in the dream, the snake was chasing me, and it cornered me, and no matter what it did to try and capture or kill me, it couldn't kill me. And so what I had was this very significant dream about snakes. And because I was doing about symbolism and all that stuff, it actually became a very important part of my mandalas. And I ended up doing the double Oribus, where the two snakes are combined in the one image. And it ended up becoming a lemniscate. So what we have, these two characters looking in two different directions, both got a similar hat, although different colors, and both with different objects in terms of what they're dealing with. So I decided that the shape of their hats were in fact a key for unlocking the layout of the cards, and that with this key, it completely changed the whole narrative of the cards. So we end up with the world card sitting in the center, where we have the mandorla. Let's not get these. Mandorla is Italian for almond. And so we have the mandorla shape in the center. Mandala is the name of the drawings, meditation drawings that people would do. And so don't get those confused. I'm speaking two different things there. So here we have the mandorla as the overlapping of these and creating the shape of the hat by virtue of these two figures. And because of where the dancer is looking towards the bull and the bull is looking back over that side, I decided earlier on that that's where card 1 was situated. And I sort of assumed that because the other figure had a hat the same shape, that it would sit on the other side. And so I ended up placing that card on the right-hand side. And then what I did was took cards 2 through 10 and placed them around the the rim of the hat, the brim of the hat, and then did the same with cards number 12 through 20 on the other side. So that what ended up happening was we created a whole new layout and relationship with all of the cards in terms of what they represented. Anybody got any questions so far? You know, I can't see you all. Please go make your microphone live if anyone has any questions or comments. All good? Okay. So here we have this layout, and of course, every man is infinite consciousness playing with the idea coming through the mandorla and going on the experience of infinite possibility, with the idea that it would enter back into the knowing, having completed the experience of infinite possibility. What I'm suggesting is that you and I are dimensions of the I am, who, whether you believe in one incarnation or many, are going through the experiences of infinite possibility. And that potentially we have the ability of being fully integrated in that place of non-duality with infinite consciousness. And that, in fact, what these cards show is how it's possible for that to transpire. The Magician, card number 1. We'll start with him. He's the trickster. This is a painting by Hieronymus Bosch, 16th century Dutch painter, called The Conjurer, and he's very much sort of in the tradition of the magician. And so here we have the magician who has a table, and on the table he has, well, in his hands he's got a wand and a pentacle. Some would say that it was some form of nut, that he may have had an alcorn or something, but a lot of people suggest that it was a coin as such. On the table was cups and was a knife, and there's a magician's bag where he had his bag of tricks. There were dice, and there was balls. So I'm going to just take a moment to sort of have a look at these in terms of what they represent. So the wand literally equates to the wands in the playing cards or in the Minor Arcana. The pentacle, needless to say, the coin relates to pentacles. The knife becomes symbolic of swords, and the cup is the cup, is exactly what it is. And so we have the magician with these things laid out before him, and what he's basically saying is, these things are all part of my trick. I'm the trickster, I'm the conjurer, and that they're all illusionary. Now, I want to talk about that for a moment in this context as a possibility. When you and I go to sleep at night, we dream. And generally, we have a version of us in the dream who's having all of these experiences of touch, taste, sight, sound, smell. We're having emotional experiences via cups. We're having experiences of conflict or success via swords. We have experiences that are sort of around finances and financial well-being, and we have experiences around victimhood or power, which are represented by wands. And while we're in the dream, all of it is real. I want you to think about, when you're in the dream state, how real are those dreams? Everything that you're experiencing, to the point where, how many of you have woken up after a dream in a sweat, aroused, despondent, all sorts of things, because everything that you were experiencing in the dream state was real until you wake up. And when you wake up, you then realize that it's all a trick of the magician. That in fact, none of it was real. It was just part of the mind. And I'm going to suggest to you that you and I are, in one form or another, a God's dream. And that in fact, we are not real either. We're real in the dream, and everything that we're experiencing is real in the dream until the point at which we wake up as part of the I am, and we realize that none of it was ever real. It was just part of the dream. And so what the trickster is telling us is what the elements of the dream are. And all of these things are part of it. What else was on his table was his gibeciere, which is his bag of tricks. That's where he would hold his tricks, and that's where he would bring out bigger balls or have things disappear, was into his bag. Normally, as you saw in that earlier painting, the bag would be worn around the waist. It's really interesting that the trickster was basically, of all the street entertainers, he was the one that was most detested. You had jugglers and you had all sorts of other people, dancers that were highly revered. These guys, because they were con men, were mostly severely detested because they ripped people off. On his table were the dice, and Pass D was a game that was a very popular game that existed for many, many years. And once again, it was a con game where he would con people out of money. And then we had the cups, the acetabuli and calculi, which is the ability for him to make balls disappear under cups. And once again, it was a very, very famous game, and it was a way of being able to con people out of. They would bet on where the money, where the balls would be under the cups, and of course he would be able to do it in such a way that they weren't under the ones that everyone thought they were. And so they became interestingly enough. So the magician's world of illusion, his dream state, included wands, pentacles, cups, and swords. All of these then played out in certain characters as depicted in the cards. So wands represented power, which was ultimately the emperor and the empress. The fact that we see the sphere and the scepter joined was the idea that those two became ones. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, and he's got his leg in the shape of the four, saying that he's heading up the four illusions. And he's illusion number one. And the fact, if he had the sphere and the scepter separate, which is what they normally were, that would have been two. The fact that they've been joined says that they together are one, and they represent the first illusion, which is power. Then we see the Pope, and he's got two columns behind him, and he has his fingers together as two, and there's two Franciscan monks in front of him, and they represent two, the aspect of two, as it relates to the notion of poverty and wealth. And of course, that's highlighted by the fact that the Franciscans were the poor monk. And we know they're Franciscans by their tonsils, by the way their hair's cut. And of course, I attribute wealth to this card because when we get to when these cards are being developed, which was at the end of the 1300s, the 14th century, going to the 15th century, the popes were basically all about power and wealth. Everything that they were about was money. And so it was a major part of what the church represented. What happened around the turn of the millennium, where monks had taken the role of popes, politicians and lawyers and academics became popes, and they developed a whole different agenda for what the role of a pope was. Then we move to cups, and this is card 3 out of the 4, and we see the 3 loves. And the 3 loves that are depicted here are represented by the Greek notion of storge, which is family, philia, which is friend. So the lady on the left is mother, the friend on the right, and then eros, which is the lover. And so the 3 loves became card 3 in the sequence of the 4 elements of illusion. And then the 4th was the swords, which represented the chariot, and the chariot was the victor's chariot of having succeeded in battle. And so what you see is this image of the chariot. And by the way, the chariot at the Il Palio in Siena is square-shaped, like this one here. It's exactly the same shape. And so it hasn't been lost in all this time in terms of its what it represents. But it was the victor's chariot. When you won in a battle, you would ride the chariot into the city that you had defeated. And so this was about the sword. This was about success. So what we end up with is these 4 cards. Now, the thing that you and I have as a trace element of our divinity is the core desire for happiness. The true nature of infinite consciousness is peace, happiness, and love. That's the essence of what it represents. And that desire for happiness became part of making the illusion, which is an external reality, very easy to do, because what ended up happening was we attributed the idea of happiness to having power, wealth, love, and success. So in other words, we became, in the world of illusion, caught up with the idea that I'd be happy if I was not a victim, if I was self-determined, self-empowered, or had power over other people. If I had wealth, I'd be happy. If I had love, I'd be happy. And if I had success, I'd be happy. And these literally become the values that we subscribe to in order to find happiness. And so these are unsustainable values because guess what? We don't stay powerful all the time. We don't stay financially successful all the time. We don't have love all the time. We don't have success all the time. And so they're ultimately elusive by virtue of the fact that this is all an illusion. Yet, this is all of the stuff that we play out. And so what happens is the minor arcana, when you're doing tarot readings, is about giving people understanding of what their experience is in the world of illusion. You're letting people know where they are on the spectrum of being at the top end or the bottom end of these things. And that's what all of those cards basically represent, is how you are negotiating the experience through the world of illusion. Any questions? I'll stop there for a second as we're going along, because we're biting off big chunks as we go along, but does anybody have any questions?
No, I'm all good. There's a lot to take in. I'm going to have to relook at the recording, I think, again, Russell.
Yes. Yeah.
So, well, very interesting.
You can appreciate that it's going to require listening to this 2 or 3 times, probably. Yeah. Okay. So we're in this situation where we're in the world of illusion. We have the Emperor and the Empress. We've got wealth. We've got the Pope. We've got the loves in our life and success. Now, here's what's interesting. All of these 3 are about infinite consciousness experiencing infinite possibilities. Right now, we have 8 billion people almost in our world, not to mention those that have lived before and those that will come, who are squeezing out every possibility of these frames of reference as a human being. In other words, they're experiencing the infinite range of possibilities that exist within all of these. Remember, none of it's real. It's just a dream. So let's talk about the magician's position and where he lies in the big scheme of things. So what we have is on the other side of the mandorla, we have eternity, infinite consciousness, okay? And that little symbol that sits underneath his table, which sometimes looks like, I thought for a long time that it looked like a prickly pear, because sometimes, but in fact, what it is the sacred yoni. It's the split. It's the I am portal, a long way away from the magician. He's so far removed from it now that he's even lost any sense of connection with it because it's right at the back of his experience and who he is. Now, he's on the left-hand side of that portal, eternity's there, and he's in what I'm going to call the spirit world. And in the spirit world, he has a companion who is called the Popess. And the Popess on her lap has the Book of Life. And basically what she has is a book that contains the potential of infinite possibilities. And each of us, as we incarnate, and I'm going to suggest, because the creators of these cards, who I haven't spent any time talking about that tonight because we're talking about this, were the Cathar in my research. They were reincarnationists. And basically what happens is as you reincarnate, you get to come back and the Popess goes, well, you've had all of these possibilities. There's a whole lot more for you to have. Which one do you want to do next time? And so we get to decide which parents we want to be with and what journey we want to have. So what's behind her head is a veil that separates the spirit world from Earth, the physical world. So what we have is 2 veils, essentially. We have a veil that separates the
You're right.
world.
What's the matter, hey?
Somebody's got their mic on. If you wouldn't mind turning it off, we can hear you talk.
Sorry.
Thank you. And then we've got the spirit world, which is where the magician and the Popess sit, and where we as spirit entity or soul essence gets to spend some time. And then on the other side of that, we have eternity. And the veil that separates eternity is the I am portal, which is the sacred yoni. And so what we have is this beautiful description of their spiritual journey being depicted in these cards in the most profound way. Let's take a moment to look at the magician's range of influence. Now, this is important once we start talking about, we've already talked about the magician's partial range of influence, which is wealth, power, love, and success. In other words, they're the things that he has influence over us with. And so the magician's table gives us a lovely indication of the fact that out of the 4 areas that's represented by the lemniscate, he only has influence over 3 of them. The first corner past the veil, which includes the Pope and the Popess and the Emperor and the Empress and the Pope. He also has control over the loves and the chariot. And he also, in his domain, has justice, the hermit, and the wheel of fortune. And I'm going to talk about those in a minute and explain where they all fit in. He has influence over what I call the dark night of the soul. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit later on. He has the ability to have us leave the dark night of the soul and get caught back up in the world of illusion. But the one place that he has no influence over is the treasury of light. And so all of these cards that are represented by the tower going all the way through to the judgment card is what's called the treasury of light. And he has no influence. His realm of influence is finished at the point at which we enter the house of God. La Maison Dieu, the house of God, which is known as the tower card more commonly, is the portal at which there is no more illusion. We're now moving into a deeper understanding of our I amness. And we'll be talking about that as we go along. Now, the magician has trump cards. Now, I don't know if many of you know, but originally the tarocchi was known as it was a card game, and it was called Il Trionfi, which means the triumphs. And the concept of triumphs became very, very popular during the 13th, 14th, 15th century. So in this, we see the justice card. And the justice card is associated with what we desire. In other words, with the things that we value, that we want to create. The hermit has to do with the element of time, the passage of time. And time is the domain of thoughts. And then finally, fate, the wheel of fortune, is associated with perceptions. And I'm going to talk about these in a little bit more detail. But basically, what these three are doing is pointing out that all of those things, desires, thoughts, and perceptions, are in fact not real. And we're going to find out why. So justice. Justice classically wears a crown, which in Solomon's writings, he described as an ornament of grace, which included the qualities of wisdom and understanding. So he talks about justice wearing a crown. He also said that justice wears a chain. Now, these are depicted in a lot of the justice cards. And it was also an ornament of grace, which was truth and mercy. So basically what he was saying was that she represents wisdom and understanding, truth and mercy. However, the scales was also representative of a just weight and balance. So in other words, what we experienced as human beings had this element of having to be balanced, or that it had to be proven that we were in balance of how we were living our lives in terms of what we desired and how we became, for example, if we were out of balance around wealth, then it was said that those scales would be brought back into balance. Now, obviously with an element of wisdom, understanding, truth, and mercy. So there was compassion involved. However, she also holds a sword. And the sword, whom the Lord loves, he corrects. And so there was this notion that correction took place. In early Greece and also in early Rome, there were two major elements to divine justice, and the key part of it was Themis. And this was about the law of nature, and basically was tied up with the idea of natural justice. So it's like she wasn't dishing out justice. She didn't have to. If you ate too much sugar and refined carbohydrates, you would get diabetes. And if you didn't manage that, you would then end up with getting limbs cut off and things like that. Justice wasn't sitting there punishing you. That was the natural law of justice associated with imbalance. And so she was responsible for natural justice. However, she did have a companion whose name was Nemesis. And Nemesis was particularly oriented towards dealing with hubris. And hubris was about pride. And basically, that's when the sword would get involved. And so things would happen to bring you back into balance if you were out of balance around pride in particular, or demonstrating too much hubris. So that required other things to get involved. And of course, that's where we start to see the involvement. And once again, there's two components with that. The first one is time. Now, it's interesting, when we go back to the Bembo Masse, which is from 1450, the hermit was called Il Tempo. And he's carrying an hourglass as opposed to a lantern. And so much more earlier on, and it's interesting, Petrarch and a whole lot of those guys, and actually there's some quotes here from Petrarch, who was a philosopher during the 1400s, talking about the triumphs, the things that triumphed over other things. And he talks about, this morning I was born a child and now I am old. Now this is significant, because here we see an old man with a walking stick, and where all the other cards are facing primarily east, he's heading west.
Oh.
And what is at the west? The end of day.
Oh.
So the hermit represents the emerging death of this character. And I would suggest to you, from my insight, this is in fact the death card, or imminent death. This is actually representing the issues of dying. So Petrarch goes on to say, time dissolves all mortal things, physical and mental. So that there's a point at which the passage of time dissolves all things. And I would suggest to you that the absence of time, if it's gone completely and time doesn't exist in the infinite consciousness side of the mandorla, time and space do not exist there. They only exist on the left-hand side, or on the side of where we're experiencing infinite possibility. That when time disappears, so does everything mortal. It doesn't exist anymore. Man turns to dust and life to smoke. Old age brings misery, and glory, wealth, power, love, success, melts like snow in the sun. None of those things have any relevance. Time in his avarice stills all, and thus triumphs over the world and fame. And so the hermit represents the passage of time, of getting older, and the consequences of mortality. In other words, what he's saying is all of these things are an illusion. They don't exist. And then we end up with fate, or the wheel of fortune. So this diagram on the right was built into the new extensions that they did in the Siena Cathedral in the 1400s. And here we see the Wheel of Fortune. It's a really interesting situation, because the Wheel of Fortune, in fact, isn't a Christian concept. It's nowhere within Christian teachings. And it came as a result of a guy by the name of Boethius, who during probably about the 8th century, maybe 7th century, was imprisoned, and he had been sort of the king's side man and had everything and then lost everything and was in prison and was about to be executed. And he has a dream with Fortuna, who turns the wheel of fortune, and he has an extensive conversation with her about the nature of fortune. And so what ends up happening is the wheel of fortune emerges. Now, this is quite involved because the one on the left is the wheel of fortune as it is depicted in the Marseille Tarot, and this is the classical on the right version of the Wheel of Fortune as you would typically see in most Christian spaces. The character at the top in both is called Regno, which means I reign. So this is somebody who is currently reigning. They're caught up in the illusion that they're reigning something. Consequently, while we've got this character with a crown and a sword who thinks he's reigning something, but it's an illusion. On the side, we have the guy going up is called Regnabo, which means I will reign. The one going down is Regnavi, I have reigned. And Sum Sin Regno is I no longer reign, or I have no kingdom. Now, what's interesting is over on the left-hand side, there is no character on the bottom. And it's what is one of two big differences. If you also notice that the wheels would actually be turning in different directions if they were to turn, by virtue of the way the characters are facing. And so we see in the wheel on the right that it would be turning clockwise, and on the left, the wheel would be turning anti-clockwise. Now, what's interesting, an anti-clockwise turn was called a widdershins, and widdershins were punishable by law because it was deemed to be anything to the left which had an association with the feminine was deemed to be wrong or evil. And so you couldn't do widdershins, you couldn't do things anti-clockwise. But here we see a very interesting concept, because what they're suggesting is in the one on the right, it's saying Sum Sin Regnio, which says there is no kingdom. If he's not there, it would then suggest that in fact there is a kingdom. I want you to think about that for a second. If there's somebody there on the bottom of the wheel and his name is Sum Sin Regnio, it says there is no kingdom. But if he's absent, then it would suggest that in fact there is a kingdom, by virtue of the absence of that character. Which means that if the wheel goes anti-clockwise, we find a kingdom. Fortune cannot aspire to bestow happiness by reason of its instability. So once again, fate or fortuna is saying there is no sustained happiness here, because you can have it all 1 minute and it can all be gone the next. So in other words, justice, time, and chance are basically saying that wealth, power, love, and success are all illusionary by virtue of the fact they're not sustainable. Now, let's have a look at what happens now. So what we have is the fool, and he goes on his journey, and the wheel's going clockwise, and guess what? He just keeps on going around and round, and he keeps on buying into the world of illusion until he goes widdershins and anti-clockwise, and now he's going the opposite direction, which brings him into the other side. And what we know now is that what he has found is the pathway to finding a kingdom. And of course, what's the kingdom? Infinite consciousness. And it's the journey back to infinite consciousness. So down where we see the strength card, the hanged man, the death card, we can see temperance, and we can see the devil card. All of these represent the dark night of the soul. And it's called a dark night because the impact of justice, time, and chance have caused us huge grief, because the things that we thought had value no longer have any value to us. They've been stripped away. And so we're now the hanged man. We're hanging upside down, and justice, time, and chance have pruned the trees that are the gallows around us as the hanged man. They've chopped away the things that we thought defined us, and we're now stripped bare. Now, what happens is at this point here, remember I said the magician still has influence, we can get caught up in this place and we can go back into the world of illusion and try to recreate it all again. And that's called the dark night of the senses. Okay, so let's talk about this intersection for a minute. When we get to this intersection, we can go one of four ways. We can mark time where the wheel of fortune is and not go anywhere. And how we do that is with addictions, drugs, consumerism, recreational drugs, medicinal drugs, antidepressants. All of those sorts of things keep us in that place there where we don't go anywhere. We just sit still and mark time and just keep living life, suffering. And in fact, whenever we get to this point here, we will be all suffering, because we thought happiness was found without us or on the outside of us in wealth, power, love, and success. And of course, what happens is justice, time, and chance show us that none of those things are real, and it results in suffering. Now, for many of you, if you look around you, we're dealing with a huge amount of suffering in our world right now. And that's because justice, time, and chance are basically taking away the things that people thought brought them happiness. We can go back around clockwise, and some people have got the energy and they go and get themselves a new partner, and they go and wear more modern clothes, and they buy a sports car, and they try to recreate the illusion. But what took them 20 or 30 years to get around probably will only take them 5 years to get around there again. And they'll find them back being impacted by justice, time, and chance, because that's built into the magician's world of illusion. Up in the top right-hand corner, if we go to that direction from here, that's suicide. That's where the people opt out completely, and they go straight to judgment and have to come back, and they'll meet the popess and go back through the world of illusion again and go through their next incarnation. Or you go through the dark night of the soul. Now, the interesting thing here is Force is saying this is a really difficult thing for you to do, and it's going to take great courage, which is why she's the Force card. This is going to take more courage than for a refined woman to hold open the mouth of a lion. By the way, where the cards are positioned, there's 2 lions side by side. 2 lions at the gate of anywhere was to check that the heart of the person entering was soft. That was the role of 2 lions, was to check that the heart of the person entering was soft. We only become soft-hearted when we've lost everything. When everything is taken away and we can't fight anymore, we're now soft-hearted. We can't get our heart on anything else anymore, and our heart has been softened. It's called tenderizing, in fact, in this form. And so we then go through this journey here. Now, a big part of my tradition, of my research, as I said, was associated with the Cathar. And the Cathar subscribed to very little of Catholic teaching. They subscribed to the Sermon on the Mount in the New Testament and the first 16 chapters of the Gospel of John. Everything else they felt had been severely distorted by the church. It was my assertion, based on my research and guidance, was that these cards were in fact symbolic of the Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount. And so the hanged man represented blessed are the poor in spirit. This is the point at which your spirit has been broken and you're now teachable. The death card is blessed are those that mourn. And mourning, when you get to experience the work that I do, is about becoming the observer. See, mourning was when you externalize grief. Grief is an internal experience. Mourning is when you create an external representation of it, and now you can see it. And at that point, when you observe mourning, you don't feel mourning anymore. And probably one of the most profound spiritual principles that you will learn in this journey as you go through this is that observation and awareness is the direct path to infinite consciousness. See, when you become aware or you become observer, you're not thinking, you're not feeling, you're not sensing, you're not feeling, experiencing anything. None of those objects are part of your reality other than the fact that you're observing it. And do you know what you do experience? In the Sermon on the Mount, it says, blessed are those that mourn, for they shall be comforted. And in fact, you come to a place of peace. And what happens then is in that place of peace, grace appears. And when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And this is the point at which temperance is pouring water, new knowledge and love and understanding into an emptied cup. It's all been emptied out. The hangman's been upside down. It's all been buried. And now it's ready to take on new. And so this is blessed are the meek. And so this is humility. Then we have the devil card. And the devil card, there's a whole lot of images there, but because of our time reference, he has two key symbols. One is the open hand, which is the element of air. And he's basically saying we let go of any attachment to thinking. The element of air is associated with the mind, and we have no attachment to thinking. The flaming sword, for those of you with a Christian background, the only time you would have heard reference to the flaming sword was when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and God put cherubim and the flaming sword at an eastern gate. So they were tests that Adam and Eve had to pass to enter back into the Garden of Eden, the house of God, the presence of God. The cherubim, according to Ezekiel, was an angel that had four faces. The face of a bull, a lion, an eagle, and an angel all in one being. Guess what's found at the entrance to the mandorla? A bull, a lion, an eagle, and an angel. That's the test of the cherubim. The test of the flaming sword is different. The test of the flaming sword is what I call the Abrahamic test. And this is where Abraham was told to go and sacrifice Isaac. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for Abraham being asked to sacrifice what he's attached to, his narrative. And in fact, it's his childhood narrative. Abraham, under the Islamic tradition, was abandoned by his father, and he had abandonment issues with his father. And he spent the rest of his life trying to have children. But because of his narrative, it couldn't manifest. And eventually, when it did manifest, God wanted to know whether his narrative was more important than Isaac. And he says to him, I want you to go and sacrifice. And what does the sacrifice entail? Cutting the throat and burning the sacrifice, which is the flaming sword. And basically, each one of us will have to sacrifice our childhood narrative. Here's what I can tell you with the work that I do is that probably 99% of the population have no idea what their narrative is. And so have no ability to even sacrifice it because they have no idea. The point at which you're prepared to sacrifice the narrative, then you're ready to enter the house of God. Now, what most people don't realize is that some of the earliest symbols of this card showed lightning or fire going up, not coming down. It wasn't lightning striking a tower. It was a tower being burnt. In other words, this is the point at which you finally voluntarily complete any sacrifice that you have to the magician's world, the world of illusion. And at this point here, none of this has any relevancy, the magician's world, anymore. And that's the point at which you now enter the treasury of light. And this is the point at which consciousness identifies with the quality of the feminine. And so the quality of the feminine is where love is manifested. You know, the Buddha talks about a mother, and it's no coincidence, by the way, that many times this woman in the star card is often shown as being pregnant. She's about to give birth. And that's the highest expression of love, is a mother. And women's capacity to find love in form, which is what we call beauty. The ability for women to, now it's not that men can't, men are here to do that as well, but it's about her ability to really encompass love and beauty. Now, if you notice where we had the male figure with the element of air and fire, and by the way, the elements of air and fire are the masculine elements, here we see her pouring water into water and onto earth, which are the feminine elements, earth and water. And so this is now, she's pouring water onto the earth. This is blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. And that's basically, sorry, that's the House of God card. This is blessed are the merciful. And in the Christian tradition, the early medieval Christian tradition, there was the corporal works of mercy and there were the spiritual works of mercy. The corporal works of mercy are her pouring water onto earth, which is social justice, helping the needy, feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, the things that Jesus talked about. And then we see her pouring water into water, which was being merciful spiritually, which was forgiveness. And that was all of the things that he taught in the Sermon on the Mount of forgiving those that have hurt you or done things evil to you, that you forgive them. And these become the attributes. And now she can see the tree of life, which is eternal life, and being able to partake of the fruit of that. I've been banging on for a long time now, and there's so much more we could talk about, and I could go on for hours and hours. If you'd like to watch any of other videos that I've done on this, if you go to my YouTube channel, I've done some talks. They're not well filmed, but the sound and the visuals of the PowerPoints are readily available, and you can see them. They're free, and you can go to your heart's content, and it's just Russell Sturgis on YouTube, and you'll find all of those, and you'll find out more about what I'm talking about. My books, let me just finish this slide up here, and we'll go to the next one. We sort of went through all of this. And the reason he doesn't do a full circle is he's being reincarnated each time until he gets it worked out. And then he gets to go back into the presence of God. At that point, when we go back through there, we have a kingdom. And that kingdom is, I am that I am. Now, I want to give you a little gift before we talk about some other things. At any time through the day, when you use the words I am, I want you to put a full stop at the end of it. And I want you to reflect on the fact that that's your divine essence. I want you to stop and go, I am that I am. That's who I really am. And then you can go on and say, who is experiencing at this moment sadness, frustration, anger, disappointment? And I want you to separate out, because what we've done is we've put a comma and we've basically enmeshed I am with all of the things that we experience in the world of illusion. And the reality is that the I am isn't those things. The I am is I am. That is, it's having the experience, but it isn't those things. And I want you to play with that notion as you move forward in your day-to-day and week-to-week, where you put a full stop after I am and just take a moment to reflect on, wow, that's my true divine essence. And in this moment, I'm having this experience, but it's not who I am. My books, The Spiritual Roots of the Tarot is just currently out of stock, but it will be in stock within the next couple of weeks and you can order it. I have a website called russellsturgis.com.au where you can go onto the website and you can order books on there. Metanoia was my first book that I wrote in Italy. It's a really heavy book. It's a great reference book. It's basically broken up into 22 chapters and it covers each card individually, but it's a heavy read. Spiritual Roots of the Tarot was when I rewrote it and made it more readable for people. Metanoia is only available from me. You can't find it at a stockist. Get Out of Jail card is my spiritual journey. And in what it incorporates, in 2011, I walked the Camino de Santiago, and it talks about my spiritual pilgrimage and my narrative and the things around my journey. And it's a little book, and you can order that online. And it's also currently out of print because I sold them all in Western Australia as well. So they'll be reprinted, and I'll have those again shortly. What I do want to tell you about is the Centre for Western Mindfulness, which is what I did with all of the information that I understood. And what I did was I created a mentoring program where we work with people one-on-one to help take them through the dark night of the soul and help them identify their narrative and to be free of their narrative. Now, I intentionally took out all of the religious language and the tarot language out of this so that it could be available to anybody without having bias towards those things, because not everybody's into tarot and not everybody's into Christianity. That being said, if this was something that inspired you and you're interested in doing it and you wanted it in the context of tarot, Christianity, or both, then I can do that as it relates to your experience. In other words, I can equate the cards and their messages and symbolism as we're going through it, but it's not found in the textbooks because we have other people that I've trained to be mentors using this work who don't have the same deep depth of understanding that I have around the tarot and around Christianity. I was a lay minister, so I know the Bible back to front as much as I know tarot back to front. I'm a bit of a paradox in that regard. So if this has any interest to you in terms of the work that I do, you can go on to the centre of, you can go on to westernmindfulness.com.au. And on our landing page is an opportunity for you to book in to do a 2-session taste tester of this work with me at no charge. And you can get a feel for what it's about. The first part of it's a video that you'll be able to watch. And then the second one is a one-on-one with me, where we actually go through and get you to explore the symptoms of your narrative. And of course, where do we know what that looks like? Who you are physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. In other words, we've actually identified 60, but in fact, I intentionally identified 56 different expressions of who people are physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. All up, there's 15 in each. So there's 60, but in fact, there was a core 56. And we get you to explore where your narrative is sitting, the symptoms of your narrative in terms of how aware you are or how aware you aren't around those things. So, so as much as tonight you've got to hear the full extent of my rationale, and by the way, all of this work inspired the creation of this program. And what we have in this, by the way, just the Chasm Part 2 is a 6-month program where I work with people once a week for six months or more. And there is a short 8-week course. The 8-week course teaches you what it's about and how to be aware. The 6-month one teaches you to be aware and have awareness be your way of life. We help you identify the cherubim. We help you identify the flaming sword, all of those, but we don't use that language. We talk about neuroscience and neural pathway development and all the sort of modern vernacular that there is, but we've created a really lovely process sort of based on the things that I've been talking about tonight.